few years ago, it seemed like Asian American voters were well on the way to becoming a reliable part of the Democratic coalition. Now, first of all, it has to be said that very few politicians bother to talk to or campaign to Asians. In 2018, for instance, over 70% of Asians in one poll said they had received no contact from either political party. Now, despite this, over the last 2 decades, Asian voters have shifted by nearly 40 points toward the Democrats in presidential elections. What's more is that the few surveys of Asian voters that do exist suggest that a majority favor progressive measures such as increased spending on public programs, higher federal taxes on the rich to pay for said programs, ensuring that all workers have access to affordable, high-quality healthcare, and what's more is that they support Congress passing environmental protections and other initiatives to fight climate change. Even I myself wrote just before the 2020 general election that there was huge potential for Democrats and progressives to win this quickly growing demographic because, number one, as I said, Asians broadly favor progressive economic policies, and number two, Asian voters had broken for Bernie in both the California and Nevada primaries. However, in the elections earlier this year, something curious happened. In New York City, where Asians make up 16% of the population, there was a hard swing among working-class Asian neighborhoods to the right. According to early exit polls, in the city's mayoral race, a surprising number of Asian voters cast ballots for the Republican candidate for mayor, Curtis Sliwa, who's the founder of the vigilante group Guardian Angels. Reporters covering the election for the publication The City wrote, "In Asian-concentrated communities from Flushing to Bayside, in Queens to Sunset Park and Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn, Sliwa led Democrat Eric Adams from a few dozen to a few thousand votes, winning outright in 137 out of the city's 317 majority Asian election districts." So why exactly did so many Asian voters shift right in this race? The most straightforward explanation is that the city's Democratic leadership has made it clear for years that they see Asians as entirely expendable. For instance, in 2018, Mayor Bill de Blasio and Department of Education Chancellor Richard Carranza, both of whom had pledged to desegregate and improve the entire public school system, announced that, actually, they were just going to make a handful of top schools less Asian. Take a look.
A group of protesters gather in front of New York's City Hall. They are there to voice opposition to the mayor's plan to get rid of the controversial entrance exam at the city's elite public high schools.
We think it's a superficial fix to a deep problem. It's sort of like putting a Band-Aid because you got cancer. It just doesn't fix anything.
In New York, there are 9 highly coveted public high schools. Entrance to 8 of them relies entirely on results from the Specialized High Schools Admissions Test, a test the mayor thinks leads to inequality. African Americans and Hispanics represent 2/3 of the city's student body, yet get only roughly 10% of the spots. Meanwhile, Asian Americans, who represent 16% of New York's students, received more than 50% of the seats last year. The mayor says the underrepresented communities are losing out because they have less money to pay for tutoring and test prep. Supporters of the test disagree.
Their parents decided to put their money towards that test. It's not rich people that are taking these courses. These are poor working class immigrants that are directing their resources towards enrichment.
The mayor thinks there's a more equitable approach.
He would like to see admissions based on school performance and statewide exam scores. He also wants a certain amount of seats allocated to the top performing students at each of the city's middle schools.
Now, is it shameful that Black and Latino students are underrepresented at these top schools? Of course. At the same time, these specialized high schools account for only 6% of seats within the city's public school system. As reporter Ginia Belafonte has pointed out, even if every seat at Stuyvesant were taken by a student from a low-income Black or Latino family, a few thousand children would embark on clear path to success, while tens of thousands of other Black and Latino children in the same circumstance would have no such obvious road in front of them. In other words, instead of even trying to deliver on his campaign promise to improve the entirety of New York's public education system, De Blasio's administration took up a last-minute scheme to diversify literally 9 schools. Instead of fighting to open or improve schools in Asian immigrant neighborhoods so students in Queens, for instance, wouldn't have to travel 2 hours each day to attend Stuyvesant High in Lower Manhattan, DOE Chancellor Richard Carranza also chose to fixate on these 9 schools and at one point suggested that Asians were hoarding spots at these schools, saying, "I just don't buy into the narrative that any one ethnic group owns admission to these schools." Then there's the issue of violent crime, which has spiked in New York over the last year. Asians have been the victims of several high-profile assaults, which were largely committed by repeat offenders suffering from mental illness.
On the heels of Monday's disturbing, unprovoked attack of another Asian victim in Chinatown, we're learning more about the suspect who's been charged with this assault. Surveillance video shows 48-year-old Alexander Wright punching the 55-year-old woman on Bayard Street, causing her to collapse. Police say Wright had alleged K2 or synthetic cannabis on him when he was taken into custody. And that's not all. Wright, who is homeless, has more than 40 arrests on his record. He was taken to Bellevue Hospital immediately after the incident for a psychiatric evaluation. In another attack last month, police are still searching for this man, who police say was inside the Broadway and West 116th Street subway station on May 12th when he swung his cane multiple times, striking a 23-year-old Asian woman on her head and hip as she stepped off the platform. Calls are increasingly growing around the city for Mayor Bill de Blasio to do more to address mental illness, its prevalence among the homeless population, and the disturbing connection between the homeless and recent anti-Asian attacks.
I certainly am deeply concerned. We've had a spate of horrible attacks against Asian Americans.
You never know what the attacker suspect is capable of or what they carry.
Jin Zen witnessed the end of the attack and video recorded the suspect's arrest. Jin says he encourages his loved ones to not live in fear and instead go about their lives normally in the city where they live.
Now, while he, of course, issued a battery of obligatory statements about stopping Asian hate and treating mental illness in order to reduce attacks, the truth is that de Blasio's record on addressing mental health in New York has been spotty at best. De Blasio's signature mental health initiative, Thrive NYC, which he established in 2015 and appointed his wife to lead, has been plagued by controversy and mismanagement over the years. Take a look.
Tonight, a call for accountability.
No one's saying that we shouldn't be spending money on mental health. We just want to know where the money has gone.
Thrive NYC is the mental health initiative run by the city's First Lady, Shirlane McCray. The program is supposed to help New Yorkers gain access to the counseling help they need. But the 4-year budget for Thrive has swelled to $1 billion, with people like Councilman Joe Borelli wondering, what does Thrive actually accomplish?
The fact that there hasn't been any transparency really about where the money has gone once it's been allocated to this idea known as Thrive NYC is quite concerning.
Monday, Borelli sent this letter to Thrive demanding more information on how many people the program helps. Borelli was supposed to meet with Thrive officials today at City Hall, but first the meeting was postponed and then
unexpectedly, the directors of Thrive just canceled it without warning.
Today, New York Magazine reported Thrive NYC has been losing behavioral health workers in droves. Council Speaker Corey Johnson even weighed in, saying he hopes Thrive and other programs favored by the mayor are not getting special treatment.
Over the next few years, the program continued to evade accountability and waste resources while New York's mental health crisis continues to grow. In other words, leading up to this year's election, there was a perception among working-class Asian voters that de Blasio's administration, and by extension, the Democratic Party, had left them behind, if not outright thrown them under the bus. Add to this the fact that Curtis Sliwa canvassed heavily in Asian neighborhoods using Asian language campaign materials, and it's not hard to see why the Democrats took a beating at the polls. So where do progressives go from here? One option is to just call working-class Asians dupes for voting Republican. As a matter of fact, woke Asian commentators love disparaging less fortunate Asians for their unenlightened beliefs. For instance, when Asian parents protested de Blasio's ill-conceived scheme to make New York's specialized high schools less Asian, one university professor took to the New York Times to call them racist. Too many Asians have chosen to preserve the status quo by buying into racism against blacks and the white supremacist system built on it, the professor wrote. But I would argue that there's another way to think about this problem. When Democrats fixate on ridiculous pet projects like diversifying 9 schools in the largest, most segregated public school system in the country, they will lose votes. When they issue empty statements about social justice but fail to actually improve the quality of life for working class people of all races, they will lose votes. And when they don't bother to campaign to certain groups, and in fact, when they act like they flat out disdain them, they will absolutely lose votes. New York's election earlier this month was just one of many warning signs to Democrats across the country. But whether they'll do anything about it is an entirely different story altogether, especially given that Democratic elites and even many progressive groups are increasingly out of touch with working class voters. As the New York-based journalist Ross Barkan tweeted last week, very little from the NGO world about how the Asian vote in New York City dramatically swung toward the Republican Party. For progressive organizations, this should be something like a crisis. Asians are the fastest growing group in New York City by far, but nary a peep. What makes the rightward swing among Asian New Yorkers especially bleak is the fact that, as I have mentioned earlier, we have plenty of evidence that a majority of Asian voters want things like universal healthcare, a higher minimum wage, and more public spending. These are policies that the Democrats could be and should be campaigning on with a laser focus if they want to win this group. But it's completely unclear whether they're paying any attention. To paraphrase Bernie Sanders, who excoriated the Democratic Party after their shocking loss in the 2016 presidential election, Democrats should be deeply humiliated that they're losing working class Asian voters.
Yeah, this is like just one more piece of evidence for a theme I think you've been hitting on for a while, that demographics are indeed not destiny. We should be sounding the alarm on that. It also, kind of just made me think about, and this is a term sometimes I use, but it's like the problem of terms like people of color, or I guess more like the meaninglessness of those terms politically. And I think some people realize that, and then I guess BIPOC was supposed to be a corrective to that, but it doesn't seem to really get at the problem. But yeah, it just increasingly becomes meaningless to try to put all these groups under one umbrella with like an unstated assumption that they're going to vote the same way or have the same views on race or whatever. And also, like in many elections, it comes down to maybe some very particular local issues. So if it can't be assumed, if you're not addressing those issues, you can't really assume anything about how voters will act.
I also want to add, and I've done a segment about this in the past, so if anybody's interested, find that. But even the category of Asian American is like very unstable. The Asian Americans, like as a group, have, I think, the highest economic inequality of any racial group in the U.S. When we hear, progressive groups, or actually really anybody purporting to speak for Asian Americans, those are usually college-educated elites, right? And something I want to point out about this race, particularly in New York, but I'm sure that you can see this playing out elsewhere, is that when I talk about Asian voters in this particular segment, I'm specifically referring to working class Asian voters. Like, I'm not talking about, rich tech Asians. That is a constituency as well. But here I'm talking about, I just want to be really clear about that because, again, to go along with what you were saying about this idea of like demographic destiny, which is something, as you mentioned, I talk about quite a bit on the show. Like, there is a divergence happening between college educated and non-college educated voters of all races. And so, on the whole, did Asians in New York still vote Democrat? They did. This is like, what happened after Trump, or like we've seen in several elections in the past. We've seen a shift among Latinos, Asians, even some Black voters toward Republicans. The majority of, these non-white voters are still voting for Democrats, but I really think that this is a canary in the coal mine.
Right. And also it's like those small margins can really matter, whether it's presidential or local election. But yeah, and I think, remember there was kind of that moment during the summer, there were a string of like violent acts against Asian Americans. And like, I feel like the Democratic Party went on this like blitz, this kind of offensive to do like the same thing they did with George Floyd, that moment with Asian Americans. And like, again, I think we're seeing like, that might appeal to a small section of Asian Americans, or probably people who are already very committed to the Democratic Party. But like that in itself, that kind of framework, or only focusing on that one particular aspect of Asian American voters and lacking the other things that they care about, is just not going to work.
Yeah. I also want to point out really quickly on that note about, the Democratic Party blitz about like stop Asian hate and all of that. You can see in New York and also other cities like San Francisco, the targets of these attacks, which, by the way, and I've said this on the show before, like lots of them, it's unclear to what degree they're racially motivated. That does seem to be a factor, but it's part of a larger increase in violent crime, which we see happening in a lot of major cities. And it's working class Asians. It's people who are working in restaurants, in the service industry, in small businesses, in laundries, who are bearing the brunt of these attacks. Again, it's not these rich tech Asians, who have been the ones to, I think, kind of become the face of like this stop Asian hate.